This is Amiable Arguments.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Amiable Arguments. I am Luca, as always, and I'm very delighted to be joined in studio today by Ethan. Ethan has graduated from the University of Exeter. He was the head of the debating society there, which definitely means that I've got my back up against the wall already.
Literally.
It's very, very snug in here. And 500 members. I think you were saying you increased the actual popularity of the debating society, didn't you? You made it a more attractive thing for students to dip into.
By about 15%, I'd say.
Yes, and then, so since then you've also been trying to become a political journalist, and you tutor, so you're a bit of a polymath. You've got your finger in all the puddings and pies.
All the humanities puddings and pies. I wouldn't necessarily say my STEM is up to scratch.
Oh, right. No, neither's mine. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, 2 + 2 = 5, you know. So.
Yeah, because when I first graduated, I was initially wanting to be an academic. And I was kind of in a good position to do that because I graduated with an award for my dissertation for having the best dissertation in my year.
Wow.
And I decided very much I didn't want to be an academic because when I was sitting writing all my essays late at night, I was thinking, do I want to only write things which only other sleep-deprived undergraduates are going to be reading just so they can do well in their essays? Or would I want to write something which would actually be influential, have some kind of impact on society?
Yes. And so let's talk about this award-winning dissertation of yours. What was your subject? What were you doing it on?
So I was doing it on the collapse of the Roman Republic. And in specifics, I was talking about how there's a guy called Plutarch who writes parallel lives to do with sort of various different bits of history where you compare a Roman figure and a Greek figure. And I decided to look at the Gracchi brothers because unlike all these other lives, it's 4 people being contrasted rather than 2. And long story short, but I argued that if you look at his other writings, you can reinterpret Roman attitudes to education. And if you reinterpret Roman attitudes to education, you can reinterpret the sources to get a new understanding of the collapse of the Roman Republic. Okay,
and what was the conclusion that you came to? Because there have been all sorts of different conclusions as to what brought... I mean, Gibbon famously in the 70s said that it was Christianity, and many have said, well, it was obviously the sheer size of it. And so what was the conclusion that you came to?
So the conclusion I came to was that the Roman democracy ended and failed because of a unwillingness to understand politics as a natural political community. So you had several different factions which believed that they were objectively right and were not willing to make compromises for the ultimate good, which is the preservation of society and the state. Because the state exists to keep people safe and to have a harmonious community. And it doesn't matter if you got things which are maybe not perfectly rational as long as you maintain that higher goal.
Right, okay, fantastic. I mean, that actually strikes me. I'm currently reading Aristotle, and he talks about, when he's talking about the polis and the city, the idea that, well, actually, a city by its mere nature is a plurality, and the job, obviously, of the politician is to figure out how to find unity in plurality.
Exactly that, and a lot of the writers of Plutarch call him a Platonicist, and one of the big things I push back on is actually said he's very Aristotelian in his approach.
Right, okay, fantastic. Contrary to all this, though, folks, we're not actually here to talk about the ancient world today. This is...
No,
so let's begin
I would say the naturalistic view of politics is actually very much relevant to this.
Well, fantastic,
and
then.
It was me doing them both at the same time that made me reach the conclusions which I have.
Okay, fantastic. So would you like to tease our audience into what we are actually going to be debating today?
Yeah, absolutely.
And discussing?
So what we'll be talking about is effectively what British identity is, its origins, and why it's a inherently ideological social identity rather than a nationalistic one.
Okay, so obviously it can't be nationalistic because, from my point of view, because the United Kingdom, British, is not a nation. It is a union. England is a nation, Scotland is a nation, Wales is a nation. So obviously those are national identities. British is, how would you describe that? What let's start there. What is Britishness?
So I would actually dispute the fact that Britishness isn't a national identity.
Okay.
I would say what Britishness was a moment in British history, probably from about the 1750s onwards, of having a very specific idea of the Enlightenment in contrast to other ideologies like that of the French Revolution, and the willingness to assert that as a global political identity, embodying notions like human rights, freedom, liberty, etc., and that was perceived as a unique thing to the history and culture of people in Britain, and as a result, that superseded the identities of English, Welsh, and Scottish, and a lot of the evidence of the time suggests that as well.
So, to understand, it's not just that it's an internal identity native to the islands, but it's also created in order to make an international statement to the world.
Effectively, yes. So, when Britain's created in 1707, it's an artificial nation. It basically only exists because the Scottish try to set up an empire, put all their money on a ship, and it sinks.
Yes.
But
sounds about right.
Yeah, but the irony is despite having this really like artificial nation, and then these sort of like really kind of pathetic attempts of the British government to like foster it, where they'd rename a couple of like street names, George Street and things like that after the monarch.
Oh, didn't they try?
Yeah,
didn't they try?
But it actually genuinely turns into a real identity, and it does so completely of its own volition. Now, lots of writers and academics have what's called the Three Nations model. So that's embodied by people like Pocock and Kearney, and they disagree with this. So what they see British identity as is effectively English imperialism. So England is able to effectively dominate and in some ways colonise Wales and Scotland. So much so that Pocock essentially calls Britishness as Englishness with pretense.
Yeah, I've certainly heard the narrative before that Britain is an English project. I suppose what I should possibly put forward is it fair to say that what is true for Scotland is also true for Wales? I mean, they came to under whether you call it political alignment or subjugation or whichever term you choose to use to centre the narrative, to frame the narrative. Wales was subjugated in the 1200s, 1300, early 1300s, and kind of just, to the best of my knowledge, is just stuck there with us ever since. I mean, we had Welsh longbowmen, obviously, very famously fighting with us at Agincourt, but Scotland was a very different story. There's more, as far as I can tell, there is more resentment within the Scottish narrative.
Not at the time, and this is what's really interesting. So when it comes to Wales, you are kind of true, but it's this specific ideological moment which Wales also latches onto. Okay. So actually it's the same for both. Now, the thing about the Scots, and this is what kind of undermines this sort of like three kingdoms model, is that Scotland at the time actually didn't see themselves as having a unified sense of Scottishness. So you actually have a really divided Scottish society, probably from about the 1720s onwards through till the period we're talking about specifically, which is around the French Revolution. Okay. So you have this bitter sort of social, religious, political rivalry between the sort of lowland Scots, which embody this kind of Presbyterian religious Protestantism, versus that's the Highland Scots, who have Episcopalianism. No, I'm not even pronouncing that right. Episcopalianism.
Okay, and just so you don't have to repeat that, what is it for those who are listening and might not be aware?
So it's effectively a distinction between Christianity in the same way where you'd have different subsects Protestantism or different subsects Catholicism. So specifically the Highland Scottish have this great religious affinity with the Stuart monarchy, and as a consequence of that, with notions of kind of monarchical power, authority, and kind of dynastic control, which is what ultimately actually aligns them more with the French and the French ideology and the British notion of the world. Yes. And it's why they get alienated from it. So if you actually look at the facts and the statistics from the era, the North Scottish, so the Highlanders, would use the same racial label for the South Scottish as they would for the English. They'd call them both Saxons. Oof. So actually, if you look at a lot of sources of the time, they'd refer to what's called like North Britain, which would actually incorporate huge parts of Scotland. And not only that, but as this period progresses, you actually see things which are quite interesting. So people in the south of Scotland, they eat the same diets as people in England. They read very similar books. They intermarry a lot more. So
I imagine they'll have more trade.
yes,
There'll be more.
So someone living in lowland Scotland is more likely to marry an Englishman than they are to marry someone from the Highlands.
It must create quite a strange sense of alienation for those in the Highlands, though. To be the part of the same Scottish country and to actually feel less in common with your own kinsmen than those kinsmen do with someone over an actual border.
Well, there's a couple of things here. So the first one is that you're assuming that they're kinsmen. When if they're actually, from their perspective, a lot of the Scots sort of saw themselves as under the tyranny of this sort of like political Scottish aristocracy, of which they didn't have much of a part of. So when we think of liberty, we often think about an American context. We think about self-determination. But actually, for a lot of people in Scotland, the British Parliament was the symbol of liberty. It was their freedom and their ability to sort of self-actualise themselves away from the Scottish aristocracy. So if you look at a bunch of the sources of the period, so many pieces of writing from Scottish people are criticising their domestic aristocracy, even when they're part of Britain. It's not criticising the Westminster government, it's criticising their own fellow Scots. It also assumes that people in Scotland aren't actually seeing themselves as just part of North British. And on top of that, of course, this is where, Keane goes wrong, because he essentially looks at just Scotland as a whole and goes, well, bits of Scottish identity were suppressed, therefore this is English colonialism. No, it's actually the majority of Scots, in alignment with the majority of English people, aligning against this very subversive part of Scottish society, which had previously spent the last sort of 50, 60 years intermittently having Jacobite invasions of the rest of the country. So in many ways they alienated themselves because they were just so ideologically far apart. The other thing to consider when it comes to all of this as well is that sure, some people did feel alienated. So we do have anonymous writers who sort of talk about how they're disappointed about the fact that their fellow Scots are more aligned with, quote unquote, a party rather than their country. But what that writer misunderstands is Britishness, and that their country, therefore, is this particular party kind of ideological understanding. Right,
okay. So what is... To bring it more into the international context, then, who are the, for want of a better way to put it, who are the big brains who sort of piece all of this together and make it less of a sentiment and more of an official, statement on the world stage?
Absolutely. So, I'll start more from the historian's explanation and then go into the history. So, so far we've spoken a lot about the people who take the sort of 3 and 4 kingdoms view of colonialism, and that's rubbish for many of the reasons we've explained. Not only that, but actually wealthy Scots marry more English people just outright than Scottish as well. But you also have an alternative view, which is that of Linda Colley, and her work is brilliant. I'm not disparaging her at all. I disagree with her, but I'm basically just remoulding her view rather than actually creating something new of my own.
Okay.
So Linda Colley takes Foucault's idea of identity, which is that you understand yourself in opposition to others, which is also where the Plutarchian influence comes in here, because of course parallel lives, seeing things through distinction.
Yes.
And she essentially says that Britishness emerges out of the French Revolution, and Britain understands themselves in opposition to France. But I think she emphasises too much the kind of nationalistic rivalry rather than understanding it as an ideological rivalry, of which was taking place both domestically within Britain and France has happened to embody due to their worldview.
Well, do the two not go hand in hand?
I mean,
the ideological rivalry and the national rivalry go together, because if the ideological... if the nations have a rivalry, however, the ideologies are comparable and the same, then that actually erodes the boundaries. That erodes the national rivalry in the same way that you see with the American Revolution, thinking that the American Revolution and the French Revolution are one and the same.
Yeah, there'll be overlap here, but it's a matter of emphasis and prominence. So the reason that I'm placing more emphasis on the ideology rather than the nationality is it explains what's going on domestically within Britain.
Okay.
Because if it's purely just Britain opposed to France, it wouldn't explain the groups that get kind of alienated within the individual areas of Wales and Scotland, etc.
Yes.
Additionally, the evidence kind of bears out it's more kind of like ideological. So the way I kind of explain it is the sort of domestic stuff going on within Britain is like a cake mixture. So it's all mixed together and you're sort of starting to get this mixed together British identity. But it's the opposition to France which is putting it in the oven and like bakes it into the cake. That's kind of what's going on here. The reason why I would also say it's ideological rather than national is it requires us to kind of go back a little bit to the French Revolution and what initially happens. So there's this concept, we may be aware of it, called Whiggish history.
Well, as in the Whig party from in the Glorious Revolution.
Yes, and that the reason why that political faction has a type of history associated with it is essentially they had the idea that there's sort of an inevitable progress of humanity. And the nature of history is different states or societies kind of catching up or being on various levels of it.
Well, that's interesting because to make a modern day comparison, and not to make any sort of statement about my views on it because it's not the time or place, but you see this sort of now with the whole abortion thing with the Supreme Court and the fact that they've repealed that decision. It's, well, no, that can't be done because we've made that progress and history only ever progresses and things only ever go in one direction, or they're only supposed to go in one direction.
Yeah, it's kind of that mentality. Now, the thing about that is it meant that when the French Revolution first broke out, it was actually really celebrated. This isn't the sort of thing where...
Oh, yes, I'm very aware of this, yes.
Yeah, so this isn't the sort of thing where Britain just has this like ideological aversion just simply because the French are French. They initially celebrate it. They think this is brilliant. This is France catching up with Britain.
Rockingham, I think.
Even people like Pitt and Burke are initially actually quite supportive of this. They think it's a really good thing that's happening to humanity. But then, of course, that changes, which implies it's ideological. The other stuff to mention, and I'll go into the thing going on during the revolution as well, but is also the aftermath. So if it was purely nationalistic, you wouldn't see things like Lord Liverpool, a few decades after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, referring to the French monarch as the only sovereign Britain can trust.
No.
It suggests that there was a particular moment and thing that was embodied. And then you can actually see that in the rhetoric. So Burke, for instance, when talking about the French Revolution and the threat France poses, talks about the perfidy of their leaders. They're not talking about French society, they're not talking about French culture or the nation. It's about the particular actions of their leader.
Well, no, because he expresses this, doesn't he? Because Burke visited France a few years earlier, and one of the things when I read the reflections on the French Revolution, one of the things that he talks about is, look, I met your clergy, I met your aristocracy, I met Marie Antoinette. They all seemed like very nice people. He says how. So it's not a hatred of France and its political institution. It's who's taken it over that he...
I mean, even that. The Duke of Wellington, right? He was educated in France. This isn't a society which has like a huge endemic Francophobia just because they're French.
No.
It's a particular political moment which Britain sees themselves as opposed to. And you can see that, for instance, Pitt. He talks about the novel, i.e. the new threat posed by the, quote, ungoverned political system. And then the actual print announcing war with France in 1793 actually says about how the ground for them making war with us is that they, quote, do not like our English principles. It's ideological.
Yes.
It's not national.
Well, but it's strange, isn't it? Because all of these sort of, the thinkers who, the rationalists who brought upon the French Revolution, although they obviously didn't live to see it, such as Montesquieu and then Voltaire, and to a lesser extent Rousseau, all had a deep admiration of Britain and its institutions. They wanted France, ideologically and politically, to be more like Britain.
Yes, and you can actually see that a little bit with Montesquieu. So Montesquieu, a bit of a digression here, but actually it's totally relevant to what we're discussing because it explains...
That's why I brought it up.
It explains... it sort of makes it clear what we're actually talking about in terms of the ideology and how it's sort of similar liberal values but actually very distinct. So Montesquieu, when writing, says about how the British have a greater love of liberty than anyone else. And that follows through in how then he approaches the separation of powers principle in France. So the concept of the separation of powers is to make sure the state isn't tyrannical. Different parts of the state have the authority to kind of override or say other bits are stepping over their bounds.
To check and balance
Yeah.
one another.
Now, lots of people in Britain, because it's sort of outright written about in these works of political philosophy, assume therefore that the idea of the separation of powers is like this universal liberal principle which, if applied anywhere, would be a good thing. Now, those people are fundamentally ideologically un-British, and they completely misunderstand British political ideology and British political thought. Because the whole point of British political thought is that you have these liberal principles, but they apply to the specific situations in the various societies. And Montesquieu got that when doing the separation of powers principle, because Britain, as seen and known by people of the time, because you have the writings of the English Constitution by Walter Bagno, talks about the balance of powers in Britain rather than separation of powers. Now, the balance of powers is very different. So if we think France, separation of powers, it's different bits of the state itself deciding. It's not democratic. It's the state itself internally holding itself to account. The balance of powers, think about the distinction between the executive, i.e. the Prime Minister, and Parliament, i.e. the legislature. Prime Minister, how do we get rid of them?
His party has to lose.
In a general election, sure, but before midterm. What happens for a Prime Minister to be removed from office, even if his party doesn't necessarily do it internally? So if
there's no vote of no confidence?
Yes, there's a vote of no confidence.
Yes.
So a majority of the legislature says we don't like the government.
Yes.
What can the Prime Minister do if they're being blocked by the House of Commons?
Blocked in the sense that...
Their legislation that they want to pass through. Or if their executive action is being blocked by legislation.
Because they don't get the votes?
Yeah.
Well, they could put it back to a general election and say, This is my mandate, this is a platform that I want to stand on.
Bingo.
Will the public back me in this?
Bingo. Montesquieu. The British are greater lovers of liberty. British have a balance of powers where if there's a dispute within the state about how things should operate, different sections can refer it back to the public for a general election where the people decide. In France, with the separation of powers, the state itself makes that decision. And that's why when we introduced the Fixed Term for Parliament Act,
this was under the coalition, wasn't it?
Under the coalition, yep. Who didn't really have this understanding and hadn't obviously read Bagno, even though he is an authoritative text within the English Constitution, so really they should have checked that before doing it. The Fixed Term Parliament Act completely mucks up the whole British Constitution, because when Brexit happens, you have a legislature which is blocking the government, and the government can't do anything about it. They can't call an election.
Because they have to wait until the fixed term is up.
Exactly. While with a standard British Constitution, you have the balance of powers. Prime Minister can turn around and go, actually, Parliament, I don't really think you're doing what the public have elected you to do. I can call an election. The inverse, if the Commons really thought the Prime Minister was acting in their authority in a way which they thought they shouldn't, could go, well, we're going to call an election. But we had this weird situation where the House of Commons could pass laws to bind the Prime Minister, so the Prime Minister couldn't do stuff, but then the Prime Minister couldn't retaliate by calling an election.
Yeah, no, it was very... And you could tell the entire country at the time just didn't know what to do, because this was such an alien thing to happen to the country.
Well, because
it was not...
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's because, fundamentally, we put a French concept of constitutionality into a wider British system where it had no place.
Yes.
And it's because people just simply...
But it's being repealed now.
Yes, because it was so evidently wrong.
Yes.
But I'm sure there are many things in our constitution which has been introduced since sort of 1997, which...
Why? What happened in 1997?
I wonder what happened in 1997. Which will have similar issues, but aren't quite as prominent.
Yes. Or might, in the case of... Because, with the Fixed Term Parliament Act, it wasn't self-evident how big a problem it was going to be until something as seismic as that. I mean, you could say, no, this could be bad because of... But until people see it for themselves and they see what a quagmire it creates, that's when, many people, they don't see it until it's put right in front of their faces.
Well, if the people who were going to reform our constitution had actually read our authoritative constitutional text before doing so, they would have.
Right.
Because about a third of the English Constitution, by Bagno, is basically explaining why the balance of powers is really important. And if you read it, because I just happened to read it after as the Brexit stuff was going on, it's almost like a prophecy where he's saying, this is why this is good. This is why the things in the American and the French systems are bad. And why if there's any kind of crisis, these things will happen in France but not in Britain.
Yeah. So let's talk let's return to the era. Let's return to that sort of French Revolutionary era. One of the things as well that I found very interesting when Burke is talking about the French Revolution, to go back to what we were previously discussing about this sort of original French, because remember as well, when the French revolutionaries were originally doing it, the aim was to create a constitutional monarchy.
Yeah.
It was not to create a republic.
It was to replicate Britain.
Yes, it was to replicate. And so it's very funny because Burke talks about all of these things. He says, look, you had a monarch, you had a national assembly, you had all of these things at your disposal that you could have tweaked and reformed to craft into something more similar to our own system.
Yeah.
But you chose, in fact, you instead decided that all of them were worthless and that you had to tear everything away and start again from scratch.
Yeah. And it's because, and this is the thing that's interesting, is you can't divorce a society from its history, because the history influences everything around you, from the people, from the economy, from your architecture. And as a result, if you just have these abstract principles and try to enforce them without concern for actually how it's going to impact society, it leads to disastrous effects. And that's what Burke basically predicts. Because for those of you who aren't aware, the interesting thing about Burke is he basically predicts the terror about 6 months before it happens. And then before the terror happens, Thomas Paine, who I used to love, and his arguments are still really good independently.
Honestly, I've read The Rights of Man. It is one of the best written works I've ever read. It's so beautifully and elegantly argued.
Yeah, and he presents all these like rationalistic arguments, really inspiring. I remember going into studying this at university, like, holding my copy of the Rights of Man like it's a Bible. Like, this is for me.
I think they did that in 1792 as well.
Yeah, this is for me, like, the moment, the Enlightenment and freedom. And then 6 months later, everything Burke says is right, and the terror ends up killing thousands of people in Paris.
And let's not forget, Paine himself is almost executed for not being radical enough.
Yeah.
So, it's funny how that turned out for him. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm glad he got out alive, but it has to have some sort of blame for...
But there's a couple of things here, okay? So the first one is that if we're thinking about Burke, the revolution, and the prior context, is that part of this like British ideological mission is that they understand that there's these sort of notions of liberty which are great, which the French also agree with, but they understand there's a more naturalistic progression to get there. So let's just compare France to Britain before the outbreak of the revolution, okay?
Yeah.
So
which one?
Well, so Britain, you have a constitutional monarch who is held to account by democratic elections. They're not as democratic as they should be, but people acknowledge that's something they want to get to.
Well, this is before the Great Reform Act, obviously, of 1832.
I'm going to get into that in a second.
Right.
This all ties in together.
Well, spoiler alert.
So you... constitutional monarchy, with the monarchy being held to account and taxation being levied on everyone and things of that nature. That's how the British state is centralised. It's centralised essentially through a more accountable and democratic process. You also have huge movements advocating for the abolition of slavery on the basis of sort of liberty. Let's compare this to France. France centralises under an absolute monarch.
Under Louis XIV.
Yes.
Back in, sort of late 1600s, early 1700s.
Yeah. While Britain has a House of Commons to make it consentable to tax the poor, and a House of Lords to make it consentable to tax the lords, the French have the estate system where basically the rich are exempt from tax. This is why France basically goes bankrupt several times during the century. And on top of that, while Britain has this great, movement which is ultimately successful in abolishing the slave trade internationally, the French decide that the Haitians have to pay for their own freedom and abolition.
Yes, David Starkey has been talking about this a lot, hasn't he, recently? Just sort of, you have to compare, whereas, because it's one of the things that's been levelled against this country a lot. It's like, well, you paid the slave owners for their freedom. It's like, yeah, but in France, the slaves paid for their own freedom, so that's...
Yeah.
And the two... You have to point out that there is a difference
Yeah.
there.
So in France, it'd be a case of, okay, we've got this principle of liberty, we implement it, boom, okay, everyone's dying, okay, oops, now we have to have a dictator under Napoleon, but he's not a dictator, we promise, quote unquote. In Britain, you have people like Hannah More, and their approach is...
Who, sorry?
Hannah More. So you have the approach is, yes, we want democracy, that's good, people's rights are being infringed. And the way that we do that is rights come with responsibilities. So if you're going to have a democratic society, you need people to be informed, they need to be educated. So we're going to open schools, we're going to increase literacy, we're going to educate people, and we're going to get to the point where we can have democracy. And that's why the French, whenever they try to institute democracy, it's always like this universal male man of suffrage, and then it results in there being, 5 republics now, maybe 6?
Yeah, 5.
Yeah, where it doesn't really go well. Britain, incrementally, suffrage gets increased and increased and increased as society gets more developed and more educated, and people become more knowledgeable about the society in which they exist.
Yes.
So
But it goes back to the classical argument, about Plato, where he, obviously he wasn't a big fan of democracy, but one of the things was that he,
allegedly.
Well, no, I think when you read the Republic, it's quite clear that
But there are, in classical circles, there's lots of interpretations as the degree to which the Republic is meant to be a serious political text versus metaphorical or even cynical.
Yeah, okay, but the basic point of, you wouldn't ask someone with no knowledge of seafaring to board and crew a ship unless they knew how to do it, and it's the same with democracy.
Yeah.
You don't get someone to vote unless they have no idea about how politics works.
And I think this is often quite an alien idea to modern audiences, but really, when you think about it, it's like with the seafaring example. A lot of people, they don't know everything about everything, and we're pretty happy, for instance, when it comes to drug approval, that not to be a democratic exercise. We refer it to people who have a specific expertise in that area. That's the same kind of idea back in the 18th century, is that, hey, wait a minute, only about half the country at this point is literate. How can people actually engage? Well, we want to live in a society where everyone can engage and be these democratic agents and sort of exercise their personal liberty, but we need to give them those skills. And that's what's going on in Britain. And that's why there's this fantastic depiction of Pitt, and made by James Gilray, the famous caricaturist. And it's Pitt on this little boat with Lady Britannica on it, between what's called the whirlpool of absolutism and then the sort of grey rock of anarchist democracy on the other side. And it's about kind of charting this middle course towards the idealist islands.
I'll have to, if you send me that picture, I'll use it for this particular episode as the background.
The other thing which is interesting about it, and this ties in with why I think it's an ideological mission, is the depiction of the sort of anarchist democracy has a Jacobin hat sort of flowing on top of it, and that's the hat which is associated with the French Revolution, but it's also associated with lots of people in Britain. It's the ideological association that's the issue, not a nationalistic one. And you can see this because actually the decline in kind of almost racialized language. So I was having this conversation with people recently, and they're more sort of English nationalists. They couldn't quite get it, but the point is that actually, if you look at people at the time, most people in Britain associated themselves sort of quite similarly with the French because they shared this sort of Gallic, Gaelic identity. Well, we know that people in Britain redefine themselves in opposition to France. So it's not this ethnicity at all. It's actually this ideology that they associate themselves. And in fact, actually, the Northern Scots, they don't even associate themselves ethnically with the Southern Scots. So you can't then claim that it's rooted in ethnicity, especially when you have all this intermarriage going on with the Scottish and the English.
Yes. But even as far back as the 1600s, obviously with France's religious wars and all those sorts of things that Voltaire was very critical of, and obviously taking in tens of thousands of Huguenots into England in the 1600s, and it's well, why did we take them? Because there was an ideological compatibility there with their Protestantism was the same as our Protestantism.
So when talking about, for instance, Jacobins, there's this piece of writing, this sort of chronicle called the Anti-Jacobian Review. And what it essentially says is that Britain and the Anti-Jacobian Review, so what they are opposing, stands for this divine right of democracy in Parliament rather than absolutism. So effectively they're saying what we're standing for is not these sort of abstract absolute powers, but the sort of process of having a naturalistic but fair society of equal play. And you can see the success of this ideological mission kind of a bit later on. So compare all this really radical Jacobite period of the 1780s to the Great Reform Act. The Great Reform Act, if you look at how they write...
1832, right?
1832, yeah. The way the pro-reformists are writing is they're using the language of how tyranny and anti-democracy is un-British. They're defining their liberal democratic objectives with Britishness. So, when they're talking, they're playing things like, before the Peterloo Massacre, they're playing Rule Britannia. That's the sort of stuff that they're doing. Compare that to the Jacobites, who basically want to overthrow all of Parliament, try to assassinate the king, etc. So later on. And also the Chartists. Yes, their reforms are quite radical, but their radicalism is things like annual parliaments, male suffrage to Parliament. It's to incorporate and develop the existing system in a way which, to be honest, people like Pitt wanted and was just waiting for the right time and progress for it to happen.
Yes.
Now, what I will say is a lot of people like to depict Pitt as this reactionary figure, but that's just not true. This is a man who opposed the slave trade, worked very closely with William Wilberforce to achieve it. And yes, there are things like the Test and Corporation Acts, which did things like suspend habeas corpus. Suspended habeas corpus, etc. But this is in the context of a global war. We did the same thing during World War II. That doesn't mean that...
Yeah, war often suspends...
Yes, but not just a war, but effectively a war which was for the soul of the world. And people at the time kind of knew this. So there's a piece of writing which describes Britain as a bulwark against the flood of oppression against the society. And Pitt himself, actually, when discussing what Britain is and when describing actually what Britain is, says the following: "It is perhaps ultimately as an instrument to deliver the world from the crimes and miseries which have attended it." That's how people see Britain. They see it as this ideological project to progress society and liberate people. And you can see that with actually the words...
But that's ironic, because that's what the French revolutionaries claimed to be doing. To liberate mankind with the universal human rights and all these sorts of things in a...
Yes, that's true, actually, and I hadn't quite thought of it in that way. But the other thing to consider as well in this particular context is that when you have this sort of mission, is that in many ways the sort of inability for people to sort of assert this kind of nationalist sort of liberal project is kind of why you see the rise of nationalism in places like Wales and Scotland now. Because inherently, if Britishness is this sort of concept, this ideological project, they're not willing to assert that kind of traditional view of the world, it's going to mean it's going to start to unravel.
Yes, of course it is.
And the irony of that, of course...
But it requires an enormous amount of conviction in one's own beliefs, and not only in one's own beliefs, but a conviction that means it has to play into that idea of British exceptionalism. It has to state that in order to exist, it has to be willing to assert the premise that there is something unique and good and, dare I say, better where...
I would completely concede that. That's what I'm essentially saying British identity is. It's a moment where you have an allegiance across the British Isles against minorities who oppose that ideology, where that's how they think. And where, to be honest, if you look at the history, they're right. Not only that, but you can sort of see how people are sort of willing to kind of integrate and move around freely within British society. So a lot of people, again, they see Englishness and Britishness so tied in with ethnicity, and it's just wrong. So, you got someone like Gladstone who becomes Prime Minister. He's a Scot, okay, who's born in Liverpool, spends most of his working life in London, and then dies in Wales.
Where does Scotland factor into that?
Well, his parents.
No, but what I mean is, when he's all of those things, I suppose the Scottishness is so small in comparison to the fact that it's just British. He's just,
Yeah, and the vast majority of texts and how people would talk, would they refer to themselves as British?
Yes.
Now, some people will point and go, but, particularly earlier on, people use English as pseudonym for British, but again, that declines over time. And also, well, what about people who use English or Scottish, etc. Well, if you ask me where I come from, I would probably say Essex, because we're in the concept of England, and as a result, I'm going to be more specific. The same way people may say I'm Scottish or English when talking to other people in Britain, it's just them being more specific. And the reason we know that is because anything international, they almost always refer to themselves as British.
Yes, they do.
So when the British ambassador is talking to the Chinese emperor, he talks about how like he's offended his sense of Britishness. He's not saying Englishness, he's saying sense of Britishness. On top of that, you can see the patriotism from the fact that the Scottish and the Welsh join the British Army in double the numbers than the English do.
What period?
From about 1780 to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. I'm not sure about statistics after that.
Wow, okay. That's a lot.
Yeah.
You know, that's especially because I assume England to be far and away the most populous nation of the Union.
Yeah, and not only that, but the thing to consider there is that this is a time where 1 in 5 men are either in the militia or in the Navy or Army. So we're already talking about effectively 20% of men. And on top of that, the demographics proportionally are double in Scotland than that of England.
Wow.
Like, it's crazy in terms of the patriotism there. Now, of course, the counter-argument to this can be, I'm kind of talking a lot about literary sources, how people are talking, etc. But I think so this is about the army, say a lot. But also, actually, the ballads. What people are singing is a commercial endeavour. Because it's what's being performed, it's what people are choosing to buy the rights to play, and it's also kind of what they're purchasing. So you have people like Maury, who, I mean, rightfully, to an extent, do point out that the British government did fund and sponsor a lot of this patriotic stuff. But that doesn't outweigh, as James Davies rightfully noted, that a lot of it's actually commercially driven, and therefore represents people's purchasing decisions. The other thing that people forget as well...
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, the government has a lot of things, this current government has a lot of things that it wishes the population to do.
Yeah.
It has an ideological view of the world.
Yeah,
but you know, there are many people out there who say, well, I don't agree with that, and they're not going to support it.
But I'd say the modern government is unwilling to assert it in the way that it used to be. It used to be very much, this is what we stand for, this is what we are, and this is what we're doing and where we're heading. And it was not just a top-down thing, it was like a unification between government and the people as a whole. The other thing as well, when it comes to sort of wider populace and what they're sort of choosing to do, is that you've got to remember this is a time of massive population boom. So firstly, in terms of the amount of the workforce which is educated in Britain, it's about double that of France. So in France, double the amount of people who are doing subsistence farming effectively. So the amount of intelligentsia in Britain is actually proportionally quite larger. The other thing is, during this period, because the population grows so much, about 55% of people are under 25.
Oh, well, that's good.
Yeah, but what that means, of course, is sure you could have all these legacy traits of like people who are more strongly associated with English or Welsh, etc. But the young people are the people who are most likely to become literate as literary rates are increasing.
Of course.
And they're the types of people who would have never known anything different. So you have this new emergent generation who are growing up literate and engaging in this kind of stuff, and their only worldview is this British mentality.
Yeah, they've only ever existed in Britain. They don't remember the old separate kingdoms of the past.
So while, yes, you can point out these other things where some people talk in some ways, etc., that's not really showing where the momentum is going and where like the dominant force is. And that's why by the time you get to the 1830s and Great Reform Act through to the Victorian era, everyone's talking about being British. I mean, heck, you know, you even have prime ministers in the 1920s who are Canadian.
Oh, yes, oh gosh, what's his name? I can't remember.
I want to say Bonar Law, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yes, no, it was Bonar Law. Yes, it was Bonar Law, yes.
And it shows that what made people seem British was this kind of like ideological association rather than simply being born in England.
Yeah, it's actually to almost to say that to be British is a state of mind. It's actually about what you think as opposed to how you look.
Yes, but it's also a state of mind which is the result of, and this is what's interesting about it, it's a state of mind, but it's a state of mind which is the product of the particular social environment of Britain.
Well, I mean, that's very Burkean, isn't it? Is that ideas don't just, are not compatible with everyone all over the world. You know, you can't, in the same way that the French revolutionaries thought they'd figured out the formula for global liberation in a very obvious, I mean, it's basically a proto-communist sort of socialist revolution, Marx wanted to find a way to unleash the French Revolutionary sort of fervour, and Burke wanted to hinder it and make sure it never happened again.
Yeah, and you can see this sense of British people understanding themselves as distinct, because again, this is why I think it's ideological rather than just in opposition to France, because I have people talk about other countries. So when you had British soldiers stationed in Spain during the Napoleonic Wars and the Peninsular War, you actually see in diaries this one particular soldier who sort of decries kind of like the tyranny of living in Spain and how kind of like authoritarian they are, and how like the clergy control so much of how people think. While in Britain, of course, we had the Reformation, etc., and people, it's more bottom up. They have their freedom and their liberty. So it's not just France, it's this wider ideology. And even opponents of the British government, okay, when talking about the Test Acts, so like Pitt's repression, they say, oh no, we're nearly as bad as Vienna. They're not talking about France. They're talking. They see themselves as part of a global context, and they see themselves as a particular ideology. And that ideology is a liberal one, but it's a liberal one which is far more pragmatic and reasonable than the sort of overly abstracted worldview of the French.
And obviously, it was also an ideology that Britain felt it had a mandate to implement throughout its colonies and throughout the empire.
Yeah.
You know, it wanted to make Canada more like it was in Britain. It wanted to make Australia more like it was in Britain, and Singapore and all of these places.
Yeah, and this is something which people in Britain are actually passionate about. So again, there will be some people who do not greed, etc. Society's complex. We can pick out individual people and form narratives. Today, just because, you know, one person believes that the moon landing was faked, etc., doesn't mean that we can pick out those testimonies and say it's reflective of Britain as a whole. Is that the British public during the Napoleonic Wars voluntarily donated £2 million to the war effort, which, when adjusted for inflation, is huge.
Yeah, enormous.
And what that effectively means is people are, their desire for British supremacy, etc., is born out of like this selflessness in the terms of like protecting people. So I've mentioned about like the bulwark against like the flood of tyranny, and there are also other texts and writings of the time saying about how like the universal freedoms of mankind are under threat from France. Because I mean, at the time it was a very absolutist state. I mean, think about what's effectively happened. You come from an absolutist monarchy to a period of tyranny and murder to then a period of another dictator who is now rampaging his way through Europe,
trying to establish all these revolutionary ideals and principles.
Well, supposedly.
Well, even if he is... No, but what I mean is, regardless of what Napoleon does in practice, that is a mandate that he claims to do it.
Yeah.
You know, they say, oh, these armies, these coalitions that Britain keeps funding are trying to quell this revolutionary spirit that we've managed to create. We have to subjugate them or the revolution's going to fail. So I'm not saying what he did in practice, I'm saying, but the narrative spun was that, well, we need to fight our way across Europe or else our revolution is going to fail.
And while some academics may say that that's what Britishness is domestically and so it's a form of imperialism, I would say it's not. What Britishness was in that period was a realisation and emergence of the similarities which already existed. So what changes is people's awareness of the similarities, not the similarities themselves.
Okay, so let's talk... Speaking of those similarities, though, we've not mentioned, and I think it's a good time to sort of bring it into the conversation, as we've probably got about 10 minutes left. Let's talk a bit about, obviously, 1707. You have the Act of Union, obviously under Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts. So, obviously, you know, and her... Was it great? Her grandfather would have been James I, or one of her, you know, who was obviously King of Scotland. And I imagine that her being still of the House of Stuart made it a much more palatable change for that to come, because Scotland would have definitely thought, well, she's still our monarch as well. But then, so where does... And then obviously in 1801, we passed the Act of Union with Ireland. So let's talk about Ireland and where they come into it.
Everything I've said does not apply to Ireland.
Okay, great. Tear up your textbooks, folks.
So, when I'm defending Britishness as not being imperialistic, etc., hands right up. Ireland was. Ireland was bad.
Yeah, Ireland was very, very bad.
So that's where Pocock is right, basically. They acknowledge that Ireland is very much an exception to everything. So a great example of that is the Duke of Wellington. He technically comes from Ireland. He doesn't refer to himself as Irish, he calls himself English. Pretty much every sort of person in a position of authority in Ireland has a direct English ancestry and refers to themselves as English. Not only that, but you can actually see it in the way that it's administered. So, perfect example is before they were going to do some land reforms in India, they decide to do and trial them in Ireland first.
So Ireland's just a guinea pig.
Basically, yeah. They administer Ireland like a colony. Now, the thing is Pitt realises what's going on here and tries to address it. So the first thing he does, as mentioned, is the Act of Union. The next thing is basically why his ministry, which is so sad, fails. Because he realises that what's going on here is Ireland is completely kind of divorced from the rest of the UK and is basically treated like a colony. So the only way to address it is if you basically amalgamate them into British society in the same way we've done with Scotland and Wales. So he tries to pass Catholic emancipation, and the king won't allow it. And that's what causes him to resign.
Because the king is the head of the Church of England.
Yeah. And that meant you would have gone from a position where Ireland would have been reintegrated into the centre, like Scotland and Wales had been. And, you know, you're sucking into this sort of like central sort of force of gravity, but instead they're blocked out. And that's what then home rule becomes a huge issue in the subsequent decades.
Of course it does, yeah. And even into the 20th century.
Yeah. And that's the moment where that happens. That was the key moment where actually Ireland could have been properly integrated into Britain like the other parts. And you can see it kind of today as well. So with devolution, it's effectively reversing what's been happening. So you go from a situation where the centre is kind of this moment of gravity for the constituent parts of the United Kingdom, where people intermarrying, you have people like Gladstone, but you also just have the fact that, for instance, the Scottish part of this great Enlightenment moment. So they actually produce 20 times the amount of doctors in England do. And then they come down to London. You get people like Jon Snow, who ends up being the person who realises cholera is waterborne rather than airborne.
Not the Channel 4.
Not the Channel 4. A far better Jon Snow, would you say. And all of that as a result of being sucked in the centre. And then, again, we have the constitutional vandalism recently. That's now being pushed away from, because you're not having that sort of central cohesive force. I mean, if you need to look at the new Labour cabinet, a huge amount of them are Scottish. Like it's a disproportionately high amount of them are Scottish.
Oh, really? I've not noticed that.
Yeah, if you look into the names, it's actually quite interesting.
Right. Okay.
And it's because up until devolution really starts to kick in, Scottishness and their sort of great regard for education and like the legacy of their Enlightenment, because it's pretty honest, there's a lot of Scottish thinkers like Hume who are like pioneering
the
this
Scottish
stuff.
Enlightenment.
Yeah.
That is its own section of ideological history and thought.
Yeah, what I basically say is Britishness is an exception of the Scottish Enlightenment in contrast to the French Enlightenment. And as a result, you see that for lots of British history. You have all these great Scottish figures being sucked into the centre.
And so I suppose the natural conclusion to where this podcast will end is to talk about more contemporary times and what can we keep the Britishness going? I mean, this is obviously a very, very similar topics to what I had with Alistair in the last conversation, but what's your personal take on it? Do you think that we can continue to maintain a British identity?
Only insofar as we're willing to assert the things which created it in the first place, which is regard for particular types of liberty and particular parts of our history. If Britishness is a particular moment in culture and a particular moment of political thought, it's tied with the assertion of those ideas. If you don't assert them, you're fragment.
But then you have to justify those ideas still being relevant in a vastly different time period to when they were created.
Fixed Term Parliament Act, I think, is a perfect example. I think the balance of powers or separation of powers, perfect example. The fact that in America right now, as you mentioned, things are being dictated to do with abortion rights by the court rather than democratic people. Good example, although you can argue other ways. But fundamentally in Britain, it's not even a court issue at all.
No.
The fact that actually I'd say a huge part of our political identity and culture at the moment is battles over our own past and how to interpret it and whether we're villains or heroes. Being able to willingly actively assert...
As if we can't be both.
Of course, yeah. But willing to actually assert this is what the world was like, this is what Britain contributed to it, and this is what it fought for.
Yes.
And actually the people at the time were aware that this is what they were fighting for.
But you have to have an awareness for why they did the things that they did.
But I think if you even, I'd say even going to the 50s, people had that. It's just that we sort of reshift our education around to focus on other things. So I think a cultural movement to assert that is necessary. And in fact, the SNP wants to do another referendum. I think it's a perfect example to bring it on and show them that they don't understand their own history.
Well, but I don't think they're interested in that conversation. I think you could win
not.
that. You can win that argument, and I don't think that would even bother them because they don't care about the past. They care about the future, and the future that they obviously care about is an SNP future where they're in charge of a Scotland separate from the United Kingdom.
Yeah, but if you look at their attitudes to free speech, if you look at how they've mucked around with the education system, etc., their sort of anti-entrepreneurial attitudes, they're basically rejecting everything that Scotland brought to Britishness and brought to the world.
Yes.
So it's very anti-Scottish, and not only that, but the only reason why you have this unified sense of Scottishness anyway is when actually people in Scotland used to be at each other's throats all the time, is because they felt unified under a British identity. So actually, this type of Scottishness which the SNP are asserting is a subsidiary of Britishness. So I think actually, if they were successful, they'd end up just fragmenting their own society.
Oh no, don't get me wrong. If they actually did gain independence under them, I think it would fall apart very, very
But
quickly.
I think the other contemporary areas is really relevant. It's basically within the divisions of the Labour Party. So the Labour Party constantly has this issue between the sort of Marxist ideas of kind of these universal principles of exploitation,
Internationalism,
internationalism,
borderless worlds.
a desire not to have military intervention, etc. Versus the more kind of British patriotic movement, but also wants to kind of have greater reforms, greater kind of social mobility, that kind of thing. And what I say is that division is the division between the people who the traditional kind of patriotic British reformers of the 1830s,
Yes.
against the more Jacobin types of the 1780s. And that's why the Labour Party constantly gets in fights with itself.
But it has ever since its creation in 1900.
Of course. But again, that's due to that historical division.
Yes, of course.
But it's also why they get into constant fights over patriotism and why what seems within their minds sort of were good ideas which are good for the global community, a lot of people in the public really dislike. And that's because even to this day, latently, within the British mindset and British identity is inherently this sort of slightly conservative patriotism because British identity forged itself in this sort of militaristic endeavour against France. So inherently to be British is to have this sort of sense of military patriotism.
So in order to be British, we need to have another crack at France.
I wouldn't go that far. I think the French have improved themselves a lot since we taught them a lesson. But it's willing to kind of assert what makes Britain unique. But
I think that from my own point of view, I think that that's what they attempted to do with Brexit. To say that actually we're not the same as a continent. We don't have the same attitudes to the way that the world works. We don't have the same attitude to how systems of government should operate.
I would say they didn't follow through with the actual historical grounding of the identity and where people come from.
No, I didn't see it anywhere in the actual debate.
People need a sense of place. They need a sense of history to understand themselves in relation to others, as Collie rightfully notes. And if you're not actually explaining that, you're not going to get the follow-through.
No, fantastic. Is there any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with, Ethan, before we wrap this one up?
I think the key takeaway, really, is to understand the unifying project of having a sense of liberty, but also grounding it within practical realities, and how that can supersede traditional ethnic conflict and ethnic boundaries, but also means it's not just this universal principle like the French see it, and that this isn't just simply a Britain versus France thing. It's an ideological thing which is also going within the sections of the UK.
It reminds me of something Bertrand Russell said, actually, where he's talking about, in his History of Western Philosophy, where he's sort of saying there are two types of political ideologue and philosopher. There are those that are consistent but impractical, and there are those that can withstand a few contradictions in order to make something that is more compatible with general human nature.
Yeah, and also read more into Pitt the Younger. great
Yes, I
proponents of
will.
the
I
House.
will.
Because effectively, what I'm saying here is it's him and his opposition to the French Revolution which really cements Britishness and creates Britain. So he's like responsible for it. And he has some great quotes which sort of elucidate this concept. So some I mentioned before, but another great one is when speaking in defence of the rights of indigenous Indians. So he uses the phrase, necessity is the claim for every infringement upon human freedom. It's the call to arms of tyrants and it's the creed of slaves.
That's very, very thought-provoking.
And I bear that in mind when people in the House of Commons decide to pass legislation because it's necessary.
Yes, okay. Fantastic. Well, Ethan, thank you for joining me. I found it incredibly informative, and I've just generally really enjoyed having doing a podcast to explore history as well as contemporary stuff. So thank you for your time. It's been great having you here.
Pleasure. It was lovely meeting you.
Thank you. I'll post once again, folks, all of my social media details in the comments and the descriptions below. Thank you to Irina. I will have William Pitt on my on the canvas this time, but Irina's artwork will be right back up there for the next one. And until then, I wish you all a very good week and enjoy yourselves. Goodbye.